The quiet storm. The evening sun was setting over Mountain View, spilling soft light across the glass walls of a modest home. Inside, Sundar Pichai sat at the dinner table with his wife and children. To the world, he was the CEO of one of the most powerful technology companies ever built. To his family, he was simply a father, a man who tried to balance endless responsibilities with the quiet moments that truly mattered. He had always believed that respect, humility, and kindness were the foundation of a good life. But tonight, as he looked at his son, he sensed something was wrong. His son, usually cheerful and full of stories about school, stared silently at his plate. He poked at his food, offering only short answers when his mother tried to engage him. Sundar leaned forward, his gentle eyes searching for answers. He asked softly if everything was okay. His son hesitated, swallowed hard, and then whispered words that would pierce Sundar's heart. "Dad, the kids at school, they keep making fun of me." The room went silent. Sundar's wife placed her hand on their son's shoulder, but he pulled away, ashamed. He explained in a trembling voice how classmates mocked him for who his father was. They said cruel things like he didn't belong, that he was only seen as different. Sometimes they shoved him in the hallways, other times they laughed loudly at him in class. Sundar's son admitted he felt invisible to teachers, powerless to stop the whispers, the laughter, the cruelty. His eyes filled with tears as he said, "I just want to be normal." Sundar felt a storm rising within him. He had faced many challenges in his life, but nothing compared to this. The pain of watching his child break under the weight of cruelty. As a boy growing up in India, Sundar had learned resilience from hardship. He had stood in long lines with his mother for basic necessities, and he had studied by the dim light of kerosene lamps. Yet none of those struggles had prepared him for the helplessness of seeing his child bullied. Inside, his heart screamed for justice, but he knew this was not about power or authority. This was about teaching his son the strength of dignity and self-worth. For the next few minutes, Sundar listened carefully, asking questions without judgment. He wanted his son to know that his voice mattered. He told him quietly that pain is real, but so is courage. He reminded him that even in the darkest moments, no one can take away who you truly are. But deep inside, Sundar wondered how to turn those words into action. What could he do as a father, not as a CEO, to protect and guide his child? What move could he make that would not only shield his son, but also inspire him to rise above the cruelty? That night, when the children had gone to bed, Sundar sat in silence. The house was still, but his mind was racing. He thought about the world he had helped shape. A world of endless connection, and yet here was his own son, disconnected and hurting. He thought about respect, about humility, about the lessons his own parents had given him. He knew this was not just a family matter. This was a test, one that demanded a response that could not be ordinary. He closed his eyes and pictured the school hallways where his son walked alone. He pictured the faces of children who had turned kindness into cruelty, and he felt the weight of a choice pressing down on him. Tomorrow, he decided, he would take a step that no one would expect, a step that would not be about power or anger, but about showing the true strength of kindness and resilience. But what exactly would he do? Would he confront the school? Would he speak directly to the children? Or would he craft something larger, something that could turn pain into a lesson for everyone? As the clock ticked past midnight, Sundar knew one thing with certainty. Whatever his next move was, it would change not just his son's life, but perhaps the lives of many others as well. And with that thought, he finally stood, walked quietly to his son's room, and looked at him sleeping peacefully. Sundar whispered under his breath, "Tomorrow, they will see who you truly are." And in that moment, the story of resilience, humility, and unexpected strength had only just begun. The letter that no one expected, the morning light crept through the curtains, painting the walls of Sundar's study in shades of gold. On his desk lay the paper he had written on during the long hours of the night. The words seemed ordinary at first glance, but to him they were fire, shaped into gentle sentences. He had chosen not to write a letter of complaint, not a demand to the school, not even a message of anger. Instead, he wrote something different, something that could pierce through the noise of cruelty and speak directly to the hearts of both children and adults. He wrote about kindness, about the silent battles people fight, about the weight of words and the invisible scars they leave. He wrote with the voice of a father, not a CEO, speaking not of success but of humanity. As he read the letter again, Sundar realized it was not just for his son's bullies. It was for every child who had ever been mocked, for every parent who had ever felt helpless, for every teacher who had ever looked the other way. It was not a weapon. It was a mirror, meant to make people reflect on who they were and who they could become. The words were simple, but inside them lived his deepest belief, that respect and humility are not weaknesses but the strongest forces we can carry. He folded the paper carefully and placed it into an envelope. Yet he did not write an address. His plan was not to send it by mail. He wanted it to be spoken, to be seen, to be felt in a place where it could not be ignored. He wanted the message to echo in the very walls where his son had felt small. Sundar decided he would go to the school himself, not as a powerful man from the outside world, but as a father stepping into the battlefield of his child's daily life. When his wife saw him preparing to leave, she hesitated. She asked if he was sure, if it was wise to put himself in that position. Sundar only gave a faint smile and said, "Sometimes the most powerful lessons are not taught in boardrooms, but in classrooms." His wife, still uncertain, nodded quietly. She trusted him, even though the idea sounded unusual, even risky. On the drive to the school, Sundar's heart pounded with every mile. He thought about his own childhood in Chennai, where money was scarce, where he shared a small room with his brother, where every exam felt like a mountain to climb. He remembered the sting of being underestimated, of being seen as someone who would never reach beyond his neighborhood. And he remembered the words his father once told him, "Never let someone else's small vision of you decide how far you can see." Now, as he neared the school, he realized those words were alive again. Not for him this time, but for his son. When he stepped into the principal's office, the staff was startled. They expected him to be angry, to speak in the sharp tone of a parent demanding punishment. Instead, Sundar bowed his head slightly, greeted them with warmth, and asked for something unusual. He asked if he could speak to the students directly. Not in a private meeting, not in a complaint session, but in the assembly hall where his son had been ridiculed. The principal, unsure how to respond, hesitated. But Sundar's calm persistence, his quiet confidence, left little room for refusal. After a long silence, the principal agreed. Soon the announcement went out. There would be a surprise guest in the morning assembly. The news spread quickly through the classrooms. Whispers filled the corridors. Some students laughed. Some grew curious, and others wondered if it had something to do with the boy they had teased. By the time Sundar stood on the stage, the hall was buzzing with restless energy. His son sat near the back, head low, not knowing what to expect. When he saw his father holding the folded paper, his stomach tightened. Was this going to make things worse? Would it bring more attention, more laughter? But Sundar looked at him briefly, and in that look was a promise. "Trust me." Then Sundar began to speak, not with the voice of a global leader, but with the quiet, steady voice of a father telling a story. He did not begin by mentioning bullying. Instead, he spoke of his childhood, of the times he had stood in long lines for rationed food, of how he felt invisible in a world that didn't see him. He told the children that he had once been like them, sitting in classrooms wondering if he would ever be enough. He described how words from classmates had sometimes lifted him up, and other times cut him down. And then he paused, unfolded the paper, and began to read his letter. Each sentence carried weight, not because of who he was, but because of the truth behind the words. He spoke about how kindness could be more powerful than cruelty, how humility was not weakness but courage, and how respect could change the life of someone standing right next to you. The children who had laughed at his son now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, others glanced sideways at each other, unsure of what to do. As he reached the final lines, Sundar's voice grew softer yet stronger. He told them that greatness is not measured by how high you stand, but by how many people you help to rise with you. When he stopped speaking, the hall was silent. Not a single chair moved. Not a single whisper was heard. The silence itself felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. And then something unexpected happened. One of the boys who had mocked Sundar's son the most stood up. His face was pale, his lips trembling. No one knew what he was going to say. Sundar's son froze, his heart racing, and in that charged silence, the boy opened his mouth. The truth revealed. The boy's voice cracked as he stood in the assembly hall. Everyone turned their heads toward him, surprised by the sudden courage he had found. He had been one of the loudest voices mocking Sundar's son. Yet now he looked like someone struggling to breathe under the weight of his own guilt. The silence was suffocating, and for a moment even he seemed unsure if he could continue. But then, with trembling hands, he clutched the edge of his desk and finally spoke words that cut through the air like a blade. "I was the one who started it," he confessed, his voice shaking. But I wasn't laughing because I hated him. I was laughing because I was jealous. The room erupted with whispers, gasps spreading like ripples in water. Sundar's son sat frozen, trying to process the confession. The boy looked directly at Sundar now, his face flushed with both fear and shame. He explained that his own father had lost his job months ago, that his home life had become a place of arguments and silence, and that he had felt small and powerless. When he saw Sundar's son, who seemed to have a father the world admired, he felt an anger he couldn't explain. It twisted inside him until the only way he knew to release it was through cruelty. I thought if I laughed at him, if I made others laugh too, then maybe I wouldn't feel so invisible, he said, tears sliding down his cheeks. The students sat stunned. Some lowered their heads in guilt because they had followed him, joining the laughter without ever knowing why. Sundar listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's pain. He realized this was not just about his own son. It was about a generation of children silently battling fears and insecurities. He stepped closer, his presence calm, and instead of showing anger, he gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Sundar's voice was steady, almost like a whisper. Jealousy can blind us, but courage can free us. And today you chose courage. The boy broke down completely, his sobs echoing in the hall. Other children who had joined in the bullying shifted uncomfortably, their faces turning red as they realized they had laughed not out of malice, but out of fear of being left out. Sundar's son watched in disbelief, his heart torn between anger and compassion. For weeks he had endured humiliation at the hands of this boy, yet now he saw him standing there raw and broken, confessing in front of everyone. The principal stepped forward, unsure of how to handle the moment, but Sundar raised his hand gently, signaling for silence. He spoke to the entire hall, his words carrying both weight and tenderness. He told the children that everyone has battles unseen, and sometimes cruelty is just a mask for pain. He reminded them that every act of kindness creates a chain that can lift countless lives, while every act of cruelty leaves scars that last far longer than laughter. For the first time, Sundar's son felt something shift inside him. It was not the comfort of being defended, nor the relief of being understood. It was the strange, heavy responsibility of knowing that his own pain had opened the door for someone else's truth to be revealed. He looked at the boy, and instead of hatred, he felt an unexpected spark of empathy. He remembered his father's words from the night before. That courage is not about fighting back with fists, but about standing tall when the world tries to bend you. Yet even as the assembly seemed to soften, as if healing had begun, Sundar knew the story was far from over. He could sense the weight of something larger, something that extended beyond these walls. The confession had cracked open a deeper reality, that the problem was not just one boy or one group of bullies, but something rooted in the very culture of silence, comparison, and hidden struggles that lived in every home and classroom. And then, just as the tension began to ease, another hand rose from the middle rows. A girl, quiet and unnoticed until now, stood slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the silent hall with haunting clarity. "He's not the only one," she said. "There's something else, something no one knows." Every head turned toward her, the air thick with anticipation. Sundar's son felt his chest tighten again. He wondered what hidden truth was about to surface and whether it would bring relief or ignite an even greater storm. The girl who broke the silence. The hall fell silent once again as every eye turned to the girl. She was small in stature, usually the kind of student who blended into the background unnoticed in the crowd. Her voice, though trembling, carried a weight that stilled even the restless shuffling of chairs. She glanced nervously at her classmates, then at the teachers who stood frozen at the edges of the hall. For a moment she seemed ready to sit back down, but something inside her pushed forward. "He is not the only one who feels invisible," she said softly. "There are many of us." Her words hung heavy in the air. She spoke of her own experience of being mocked not for her father's fame or wealth, but for the clothes she wore, the food she brought in her lunchbox, the quiet way she carried herself. She described how children laughed at the patched bag she carried to class, how they whispered about the way her family could not afford what others had. She admitted that the cruel laughter had made her believe for a long time that her life was worth less. Her eyes filled with tears as she confessed, "Sometimes I thought it would be easier if I just disappeared." Gasps echoed in the hall. Sundar's son felt his heart clench. He realized in that moment that his pain was not isolated. It was part of a larger web of silent suffering woven through the lives of many around him. The girl's voice, fragile yet unyielding, pierced through the illusion that bullying was just a harmless game of laughter. It was not a game. It was a wound that spread quietly, cutting deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The principal shifted uneasily, as if the truth being spoken was too much to bear. Some teachers exchanged nervous glances, realizing the problem was not only about children misbehaving but also about the adults who had failed to listen. Sundar watched carefully, his sharp eyes observing not only the children but the silence of authority. He knew then that this moment was greater than he had imagined. It was not about defending his son anymore. It was about giving voice to every child who had been silenced by fear. The girl's courage sparked something unexpected. Another hand rose. Then another. Soon voices began to emerge from every corner of the hall. One boy admitted he had been laughed at for his accent. Another confessed he had been teased for struggling with his grades. A girl whispered that she had stopped eating lunch at school because she could not bear the ridicule about her food. With each story, the weight of the room grew heavier until it felt like everyone was carrying a burden too large for their small shoulders. Sundar stood still, his heart pounding. He could see his son's eyes widen as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing a truth too big to ignore. The bullying was not just against one child. It was a culture that had gone unchecked, fed by silence, fear, and the desperate need to belong. Sundar knew this was the moment where everything could change, if someone had the courage to guide the broken pieces into something whole. He took a step forward and spoke gently, almost as if to soothe the trembling voices that had just risen. "What you are saying is brave," he told them. "Every word you share is a light in the darkness. You are teaching us something today, something even adults forget. Cruelty never begins in strength. It begins in weakness, in fear, in wounds that have not healed. But kindness begins in strength. And right now, each of you has the chance to choose strength." The children listened, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Some were still wiping away tears, others sat rigid in shame. Sundar's son looked at the girl who had first spoken up, and for the first time he felt something stronger than his own pain. He felt respect. He realized that true courage was not about never being afraid. It was about standing up when fear told you to stay silent. And then, unexpectedly, the principal cleared his throat. His face was stiff, his voice formal, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed unease. "Perhaps this is not the right place for these discussions," he said carefully. "We should return to class." The words struck like ice. The children froze, their newfound courage hanging in the air, fragile and unsteady. Sundar looked at the principal, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. And for the first time that morning, his voice carried the quiet steel of a man who had led millions. "If not here, then where?" he asked softly. "If not now, then when?" The room held its breath. Even the teachers lowered their eyes, unable to answer. Sundar knew he had touched a nerve. The walls of silence that had protected cruelty for so long were cracking, and this moment could either seal them back shut or break them wide open forever. The teacher's burden. The hall, already heavy with silence, seemed to hold its breath as the teacher stepped forward. She was one of the quieter ones, known more for her gentle smile than for raising her voice. But now, as she stood before hundreds of children and staff, her hands shook and her face carried the weight of something long buried. She pressed her palms together as if steadying herself, then looked at the principal with eyes full of quiet defiance. "I cannot stay silent anymore," she said. "What these children are saying, it is true, and it has been happening for a long time." The students shifted in their seats, surprised to see an adult breaking the invisible line of authority. She admitted that she had seen the mocking, the whispering, the exclusion. She had heard the laughter that cut deeper than any knife, and though her heart ached for the children, she had done nothing. Why? Because the culture of silence did not belong only to the students, it lived among the teachers too. She explained how some teachers looked the other way, not because they didn't care, but because they feared losing respect, feared being seen as weak, feared the endless complaints of parents who demanded grades but ignored kindness. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I let myself believe it was not my place to interfere, and in doing that I failed you." The room was stunned. The students who had confessed earlier now realized that even the adults they trusted had been caught in the same web of silence. Sundar's son felt something strange in that moment. An ache, yes, but also a flicker of hope. Because if a teacher could admit failure openly, maybe healing was possible. Sundar watched closely, his eyes steady, recognizing the rare strength it took for her to bear her truth in front of both her peers and her students. The principal's face hardened. His authority, which had always gone unquestioned, was being pulled apart thread by thread. "This is highly inappropriate," he said sternly. "We cannot allow personal confessions to disrupt the discipline of this institution." His words echoed coldly through the hall, but this time, the silence that followed was not fear. It was rejection. Students looked at one another with disbelief, and teachers shifted uncomfortably, realizing the wall of authority no longer held the same weight it once did. Sundar stepped forward again, but his voice was softer than anyone expected. He did not raise it against the principal. Instead, he turned to the children and spoke directly to them. "You see what is happening here," he said gently. "You see how silence has trapped not only you, but even the people meant to guide you. This is why change is so hard. But change always begins in the same way, with one voice daring to speak when everyone else is quiet. And today you have all proven that you are capable of that kind of courage." His son looked at him with wide eyes, his chest swelling with something unfamiliar, pride. For the first time in weeks, he no longer felt small. He no longer felt invisible. He saw that his pain had started a wave that was bigger than himself, a wave that was washing through the hall, breaking chains of fear that had held everyone for too long. And then, just when it seemed the tide was turning, the principal's voice cut in again, sharper this time, almost desperate. "Enough," he snapped. "This assembly is over." Everyone returned to class, but no one moved. The children remained seated, the teachers frozen in place. The hall was filled not with obedience, but with defiance. The silence that followed was no longer born of fear, but of strength. Sundar looked around, his heart beating fast, realizing the truth. This was no longer just about his son or a letter. This was a battle between silence and truth, between authority and humanity. And then, before anyone could speak again, the principal made a sudden announcement, his voice low and dangerous. "If you will not return to class," he said coldly, "then I will have no choice but to call the Board of Education. And if I do, some of you may regret what has been said today." Gasps filled the room. The threat hung in the air like a blade, sharp and heavy. Sundar's son felt his stomach drop. The courage that had been building inside the children began to waver under the weight of fear once more. The choice that changed everything. The principal's threat echoed in the hall like a cold wind, cutting through the fragile courage that had just begun to bloom. Students who had bravely spoken now lowered their eyes, fear creeping back into their hearts. Teachers who had shifted uncomfortably moments before stood frozen again, as if reminded of the chains of authority. Sundar looked around the room and felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He knew this was the crossroads. If fear was allowed to take hold again, all the voices that had risen would sink back into silence, and the chance for change would be lost. Sundar took a slow breath and stepped forward. His voice was calm, steady, yet there was an edge of fire beneath it. "You may call the Board of Education," he said softly, "but remember this. What they will hear is not just words of defiance. They will hear the truth, and truth cannot be silenced by threats." His gaze swept the room, not at the principal, but at the children. "Each of you has shared a piece of your heart today. Do not let fear steal it away. What you did was brave. Do not give that back." The children stirred, some lifting their heads, others exchanging nervous glances. Sundar's son felt his father's words wrap around him like armor. For weeks he had felt small, powerless. But now he understood. True power was not about control, it was about honesty, about the courage to keep standing when the world tried to bend you. The principal's face grew red, his authority cracking under the quiet strength that was spreading across the hall. "You are undermining discipline," he snapped. "This school cannot function if children think they can challenge their teachers." Sundar's reply was gentle, but it struck like thunder. "Discipline without compassion is not strength, it is fear. And fear builds walls, not futures. Schools are meant to shape human beings, not silence them. If students cannot trust their teachers with their pain, then what are we teaching them?" His words hung in the air, undeniable, like the sound of a bell that could not be unheard. The teacher who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, her eyes shining with quiet resolve. "He is right," she said firmly. "We cannot go back to silence. Not after this." Slowly other teachers nodded, some reluctantly, others with newfound courage. The weight of authority was shifting, not from the principal alone, but toward a collective voice that demanded humanity first. Sundar turned once more to the children, his eyes soft. "Remember this moment," he told them. "Remember that your voice matters even when you feel small. Kindness will always take more courage than cruelty. but it will also take you further than cruelty ever can. And then, something extraordinary happened. Sundar's son, who had been silent the entire time, stood up. His legs trembled, but his voice, though small, carried across the hall. "I forgive them," he said. "The ones who laughed at me, the ones who pushed me. I forgive them." A hush fell over the hall. The children stared at him, some in shock, others with tears welling in their eyes. And then he added, his voice stronger, "But I want us to do better. Not just for me. For everyone." The hall broke. Students clapped, some cried, some simply sat in awe. Even the boy who had confessed his jealousy earlier wept openly, as if released from a weight he had carried too long. The girl who had spoken of her patched bag smiled through her tears, her face glowing with a strength she had never felt before. The wave of emotion swept through the hall like a storm, but it was not destruction. It was cleansing, healing, rebuilding. The principal, cornered and stripped of his authority, said nothing more. The truth had already won, carried not by anger but by humility, kindness, and the refusal to stay silent. Sundar placed his arm gently around his son's shoulder, whispering words only he could hear. "This is your strength. Never forget it." That evening, as the sun set once again over the glass walls of their home, Sundar sat with his son in the quiet of their living room. No headlines, no cameras, no boardrooms, just father and son. His son leaned against him, lighter than he had been in weeks, and Sundar knew in his heart that the move he had made was not about stunning the world. It was about reminding his son and everyone who had listened that greatness is not measured in power or wealth, but in the courage to choose kindness when cruelty seems easier.